Canada's International Trade Minister Maninder Sidhu says there is mutual interest to advance trade talks with South America's Mercosur bloc.
Canada may be close to another major trade deal, but here's the part that matters more. This is not a rescue, it is insurance. And that is the lens you need for everything happening right now. Because Ottawa is pushing toward a possible Mercosur deal at the exact same time North America is heading into a dangerous USMCA review window. Reuters has reported that Canada wants a Mercosur agreement this year, while the USMCA review reaches a key checkpoint by July 1st. So if you only hear New Deal, you may think, Canada is replacing the United States? That is not the story. If you only hear July 1st, you may think North American trade collapses this summer. That is not the story either. The real story is harder, but much more important. Canada is trying to build one more leg under the table before the room starts shaking harder. That's it. That's the metaphor. The US leg is still the biggest one, still the heaviest one, still the one Canada depends on most. But Ottawa clearly believes one leg is not enough anymore. And that is why this Mercosur push matters. Let's start with the basic fact. Yes, this deal is real. This is not random diplomatic theater. Canada has been moving faster on trade diversification because the US environment has become more volatile. Reuters has reported that Carney wants a trading order less reliant on the United States, and Canada's non-US exports have already hit record levels as Ottawa tries to widen its options. That matters because it tells you this is not just one trip, one handshake, one press release. It is part of a pattern. Canada is trying to reduce the danger of overdependence, not eliminate dependence overnight. Reduce the danger. That distinction matters. Now let's get something else straight right away. Mercosur is important, but it is not magic. Even if Canada signs the deal this year, Mercosur will not suddenly replace the scale, proximity, and integration of the US market by 2026. That is too fast, too neat, too unrealistic. What it can do is something more subtle, but still very valuable. It can give Canada more optionality, more bargaining room, more credibility, and a stronger signal that Ottawa is not entering the next phase of North American trade completely empty-handed. That is why I keep saying this is insurance, not escape. Insurance. Now, why is Canada doing this now? Because Washington is sending a very clear message. The US side is not signaling a return to the old comfort zone. Reuters reported that US Trade Representative Jamieson Greer said offshoring and rules of origin will be central in the next round of trade talks, especially around Mexico, and that tariffs are effectively here to stay. In plain English, Washington is not preparing a softer perimeter. It is preparing a tighter one. And if you are Ottawa, that changes the whole calculation. Because once the dominant partner starts saying, we like tariffs, we want stricter origin rules, we want less offshoring, and we are not nostalgic for the old zero-tariff world, then standing still becomes its own kind of risk. That is the real trigger here. Not Canadian excitement about South America for its own sake, but a growing Canadian judgment that the old US-centered comfort model is no longer safe enough to leave unhedged. Now here is where I want to slow this down because this is the part a lot of viewers get wrong. People hear New Deal with Mercosur. Then they immediately jump to, so Canada is leaving the US behind. No, that is not what serious trade strategy looks like. Serious trade strategy usually moves in layers. First layer, signal that you have options. Second layer, build enough real commercial pathways that those options start to matter. Third layer, use those options to negotiate with a little less fear than before. Canada is somewhere between the first and second layer. That is the honest reading. The signal is already real. The full commercial weight is not there yet. and that is why timing is everything. Now, let's talk about July 1st, because this is the other place where too much bad analysis is floating around. July 1st matters, but July 1 is not the edge of a cliff. Reuters reported that Canada's chief negotiator Janice Charette said very clearly that July 1st is a checkpoint, not a cliff. If everything is not resolved by then, the agreement does not simply vanish the next morning. Instead, if the parties do not extend the pact for another 6 years, it moves into annual reviews. That still raises uncertainty, and uncertainty is expensive, but it is not the same thing as instant collapse. That is a much better way to think about the summer. Not, everything ends in July, but the pressure intensifies in July. And when pressure intensifies, governments that prepared options look smarter than governments that did not. That is why the Mercosur story matters now. Not because it solves Canada's US problem, but because it changes the political and economic atmosphere around the US problem. Now here's the plain English recap. So far, the real story is this. Canada thinks the North American trade environment is becoming more dangerous. The US is openly signaling a harder tariff and rules posture. Ottawa is trying to widen its options before that pressure gets worse. And a Mercosur deal would not replace the US, but it would make Canada look less trapped than before. That is the value. Less trapped, not independent. Less trapped. Now, what makes Mercosur attractive in this context? Two things. First, scale. It is a serious regional bloc, not a symbolic side market. Second, fit. There are sectors where Canada has obvious interest in building alternative access and demand beyond the United States. That means even before the deal reaches full maturity, the direction itself matters. Because trade politics is not just about what is fully implemented today. It is also about what markets believe may become available tomorrow. And expectations shape behavior early. If Canadian firms believe Ottawa is widening the runway, that can affect planning before the final commercial payoff arrives. If Washington believes Canada is not standing still, that can affect negotiation posture too. That is why agreements can matter before they fully bite. Now, let's bring Carney into this the right way. Not as some magician who can replace the US with one trade mission. That's not serious. But as a prime minister who is clearly trying to reposition Canada from passive dependence to active hedging. Reuters reported that Carney has been prioritizing self-reliance, infrastructure, and a broader effort to make the Canadian economy less exposed. Reuters also reported today that he said Trump had not raised any so-called entry fee with him, and that Canada is prepared for a thorough negotiation and is willing to delay if necessary, rather than make concessions just to get talks going. That tells you something important. Canada is still structurally weaker than the US in this relationship. But politically, Ottawa is trying not to behave like a supplicant. That is a real shift. Weak structurally, firmer politically. That is the posture. And that posture is exactly why another trade deal matters. Because it gives political firmness a little more economic substance behind it. Now, let's be honest about the limit. Even if Mercosur is signed this year, and even if Canada moves faster than expected, the US will still be Canada's main trade gravity point by a very wide margin. That is why I would be very careful with triumphalist language. This is not Canada is free. This is, Canada is trying to reduce the cost of being exposed. Again, insurance. That is the cleanest, most honest frame. And once you see it that way, the whole story becomes easier to read. Ottawa is not telling the world, we no longer need America. Ottawa is signaling, we cannot afford to have America as our only serious pillar anymore. That is a very different message, and it is much more believable. Now, why should ordinary viewers care about any of this? Because trade structure sounds abstract until it isn't. If Canada has more options, then shocks from the US are a little less absolute. If Canada has fewer options, every tariff threat, every rules change, every review scare hits harder. So the issue is not whether Mercosur instantly changes your life this summer. It won't. The issue is whether Canada is entering the next phase of US pressure with at least a few visible alternatives beginning to take shape. That affects confidence, investment, negotiation, and eventually jobs, sectors, and pricing power. That is why this matters. Now let me give you one more plain English recap before the close. Another major trade deal may be coming. Yes, that is real. But the smartest way to read it is not as replacement. It is as preparation. Canada sees the US risk. Canada sees the summer checkpoint. Canada sees the possibility of a tougher North American trade environment. And Canada is trying to make sure it is not entering that environment with only one leg under the table. That is the whole story. So here is the real Tradeconomics take. Yes, another major trade deal may be coming. But the most important thing about that deal is not what it replaces. It is what it signals. It signals that Ottawa no longer believes the old comfort zone is safe enough. It signals that diversification is now a necessity, not a slogan. And it signals that before the next North American stress test gets harder, Canada wants at least one more support in place. That is the shift. Not freedom. Positioning. Not escape. Insurance. Not a magical substitute for the US market. A deliberate attempt to make overdependence less dangerous before the pressure rises. So here's the question that matters most. If Canada really is close to another major trade deal, is this the start of real leverage, or just the first layer of protection before a much harder fight with Washington? If you found this analysis useful, subscribe, share the video, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. At Tradeconomics, we follow the markets first, then expose the power mechanics underneath. Because the real story is never just the deal, never just the headline, and never just the summit photo. It's who gains room to move, who stays exposed, and how the system is shifting underneath it all. See you in the next one.